Luke 19, 1-10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." For the past 6 weeks, we have been at the table with Jesus, exploring his recipes for radical hospitality at Simon's house, spiritual growth at the table of Levi, mission on the hillside with the 5,000 plus, abundant grace in the home of Mary and Martha, and community engagement at the Pharisees' house. Today, we join Jesus at the table of Zacchaeus with the recipe of extravagant generosity. Zacchaeus, a man whose name means innocent and clean, which is the opposite of how he's seen by his community and fellow Jews. That's because he's a tax collector, and like we've been talking about during this series, these guys were no one's favorite because they often cheated and exploited their neighbors so they could line their own pockets. The text says that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, so he had oversight over others and even more opportunity to get rich. In the Gospels, the rich are often portrayed negatively, but not because they're rich, because they lack generosity. In earlier chapters of the Gospel, we meet some of them. In Luke 12, the rich fool builds bigger and better barns for all of his grain instead of sharing it. In Luke 16, the rich man refuses to help Lazarus, who is homeless and starving on his doorstep. And then in Luke 18, Jesus invites the rich ruler to follow him by selling his possessions and giving to the poor. But he declines because his wealth holds too great a space in his heart. Now here in Luke 19, Zacchaeus gets his turn in the story. As news spreads that Jesus is passing through town, a crowd gathers, and Zacchaeus is curious too. He wants to see Jesus, but he's too short to see over the crowd. As a taller person, I know that when I'm taking a group selfie or I'm at the Springton Manor barn trying to see those adorable baby goats, the kinder and more generous place for those who are shorter than me is in the front. But because of Zacchaeus' line of work and his reputation in the community, the crowd doesn't move over, and they don't usher him to the front. They don't give him the place of honor, as Pastor Amy talked about last week, or recognize his dignity. So he decides to climb a tree, an action that's seen as awkward and dishonorable for a grown man. But Zacchaeus doesn't care anymore because he's already excluded by everyone. Well, almost everyone. Zacchaeus climbs the tree in hopes of catching a glimpse of Jesus. And then Jesus ends up catching a glimpse of him. In this moment, Jesus again turns the tables and upends the social norms, ready to serve up his recipe of extravagant generosity. Unlike the crowd, he sees Zacchaeus with kindness and compassion. He sees a willing and an open heart just waiting for the invitation to something more, something deeper. And so Jesus calls him down out of the tree and out of a life trapped by greed and corruption. And then Jesus invites himself over for dinner, taking the role of guest at Zacchaeus' table, giving him honor, something the crowd was unwilling to do. Jesus extends grace and hospitality beyond what anyone might expect, and extravagantly more than the grumbling crowd even finds acceptable. That's what extravagant generosity modeled by Jesus looks like. Giving more grace, more kindness, more time, more resources than anyone expects or can even imagine. More than just enough. More like Jesus, because of Jesus. Not a one-time act, but a way of life. Not a one-time large donation, but a state of heart. The crowd wants Zacchaeus to stay up in the tree, stay on the outside of the circle. But Jesus invites him to relationship and to conversation, to faith and transformation, to loosen his grip on the lifestyle that takes advantage of others, to follow Jesus with a generous heart. And generosity starts with receiving. Jesus gets the saying that we cannot give what we have not received. And so he asks Zacchaeus for a lunch date. And he doesn't invite himself over at some future time when Zacchaeus has his act together. He doesn't require that he change his ways before sharing a meal. Jesus doesn't even wait for him to go clean the bathroom or run to Wegmans. Instead, Jesus heads over to Zacchaeus' place immediately. Because for Jesus, it's less about the food and more about the lesson. He doesn't care about an extravagant meal. He would be fine with leftovers from last night. He cares more about the generosity of Zacchaeus' heart. And as they share a meal and conversation together, Jesus turns leftovers into communion. Unlike the other rich men in Luke's gospel who reject God's generous offer of grace and salvation, Zacchaeus responds to it with gratitude and generosity. In fact, in the middle of the meal, he stands up and makes this public statement. Lord, I'm going to give half of my possessions to the poor, and all of those people I cheated, I'm going to pay them back 4 times the amount. Following Jesus' example, Zacchaeus feels compelled to give more than what's necessary. Jewish law required that those who committed crimes or theft pay restitution to restore what had been taken to its original owner, to make things right. Normal restitution required the accused to pay back what was stolen plus 20%. That's like a nice tip after dinner at Anthony's in Downingtown. But Zacchaeus, he promises 400%, going above and beyond what was required. Zacchaeus offers this kind of extravagant gift not to boast, and not because it's required of him. Jesus doesn't ask him to do this. He's not trying to earn God's grace. He has already received it. He offers it as an expression of his faith, a response to the generosity of Jesus. And he doesn't just give extravagantly to those he cheated. He gives half of his possessions to the poor as an act of justice and care for others. He recognizes the mission of Jesus to feed the hungry and visit the sick, to proclaim good news to the poor and freedom for those who are all bound up. And Zacchaeus is in. He wants to take part in God's saving work in the world. He wants to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven until he gets to heaven. At the table in Zacchaeus' home, Jesus invites this chief tax collector to a life of discipleship, of following and mirroring the heart, mind, and work of Christ, of responding to the generous heart of God with extravagant generosity? And Zacchaeus says yes, by giving what he holds most dear, his wealth, his biggest obstacle, the thing that keeps him disconnected from God and everyone else in his community. He's not doing it for accolades, but for freedom. And as he commits to a life of generosity, he comes closer to his community and closer to the heart of God. Jesus sees this change of heart in Zacchaeus. And in words that must have shocked the listeners, Jesus extends generosity again and includes Zacchaeus in the family. Today, salvation has come to this house. Jesus' invitation of salvation comes not because Zacchaeus made a sizable donation or said a certain prayer, but because he could see Zacchaeus bending his heart towards God. Jesus takes the generous initiative to call Zacchaeus out of the tree, and he responds in gratitude. And then Jesus is generous again by offering salvation not just to Zacchaeus, but to his whole household. The expectation is that his salvation, his transformation, his new lifestyle of faith and generosity will affect his family. Now the people in his household may be more generous. As a chief tax collector, those in his charge now may be more generous. Maybe those of us listening to his story today will be too. This is the invitation from Jesus to Zacchaeus. And because Jesus sees the uniqueness of our situations, the invitation to discipleship, to follow Jesus, will look different for each of us. Where is God inviting us to be extravagantly generous, to give more than what's needed and more than enough? It could be that what we're putting in the offering plate or in Venmo. It could be the mission projects we take part in or the way that we serve in the church and the community. Maybe God is inviting us to show generosity in the way that we see other people, to be quick to listen and slow to judge, to have a generous mind and a willingness to understand, or to extravagantly give our time, our prayers, our kindness. God invites each of us to develop a more generous heart, one that mirrors the example of Jesus and takes part in the work of Christ in the world. Jesus calls Zacchaeus out of the tree with abundant grace, welcomes him into his company with radical hospitality, invites conversation about salvation and spiritual growth. Jesus declares his mission to reach and serve people. He sees the imago Dei, the image of God in Zacchaeus, giving him a place of honor. And at Zacchaeus' home, Jesus shares this recipe for extravagant generosity. And when followed, we learn to give more than what's needed or expected, to live with generous hearts that give in gratitude for the generosity of God. Jesus transforms this table into an altar at which all of God's children are invited to come. There he shares bread and extravagant generosity, saying again and again, "Do this in remembrance of me."